Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'm continuing on my series of merge boot rankings, this time doing mine for Australian Survivor. Now this video will only cover the Network 10 version of Australian Survivor. I will eventually down the road do a International Survivor merge boot ranking, which will include the other versions of Australian Survivor, but this will only be the Network 10 version of the show, which as of right now has 7 seasons to be going from. Again, we will obviously be ranking all the players that got voted out at the first tribal after the merge, based on how I feel like they played across that season. And with that, let's jump right into it. At number 7, the worst merge boot to me from Australian Survivor is Andy from Australian Survivor Champions vs. Contenders 2. Now, Andy is someone that I can see the argument for him being higher than the next person we'll talk about. However, I feel like Andy just played actively worse than the next person we'll be talking about, where Andy is someone that played really hard across the season, but did so in a way that made him come off as schemy to his other players, but also did so in a way that, no one trusted him throughout pretty much the majority of the season. I mean, he does start off the game seemingly in a decent position where he is kind of in the middle of the initial contenders tribe. And that initial contenders tribe only goes to tribal one time. And really, I feel like that's probably the best part of his game, is where he's not in the bottom at that point. That's something. But then he comes into the swap where he's swapped into a very good position where he is part of this contenders majority, where it's only Luke and David on the bottom, yet he still ends up in the minority on that vote, where Daisy, Baden, and John end up flipping to vote out Sam, which in turn again leaves Andy on the bottom from that round. He then becomes the secondary target in the round immediately afterwards, where the people that did vote for him in that round, in Sarah and Hannah, end up flipping against him and try to get him voted out. To where, again, I think this is a situation where he's only kept around because of physical strength. I don't think he's someone that is particularly well liked or well respected there. And then we get to the next round where he tries to work with David and Luke, but also tells them misinformation at the same time that really gains him no leverage here. I mean, yes, he has a factor in both of them ending up using their idols, but it does so in a way that completely burns his relationship with David and Luke moving forward, and also makes him come off as sketchy to his original alliance. That's questioning why he was telling Luke and David these things. And then coming to the merge, he was just an easy consensus boot, to where, despite the fact that his original contenders had the power to come out of this round on top, with Daisy having an idol and them having half the numbers on their side, they still decide to just say screw it and vote out Andy anyway, which leads to most of them just going out in a row. It really is an indictment on Andy that he's not able to get people to do what's in their best interest there, largely because of this massive perception that he was building for himself. So again, I think all that is pretty poor play, and it's what leaves him at the bottom here at number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to, again, someone I think you can debate is worse than Andy, particularly for one specific reason to me. But at number 6, we do have Connor, the merge boot from Australian Survivor 2016. And I think the big negative for Connor is that he was technically voted out at the double tribal. That does lead to him swapping tribes. Though I will say, I don't hold this that much against him. Now, while he does play that round particularly poorly, and where he almost pulls off a flick blindside, but through him leaking too much information, he causes Matt to flip, which causes a tie vote, and then eventually he just tells the tribe to vote him out once they realize that it's a non-elim, which again is why I don't hold it that much against him. He gets voted out, but in a situation where he tells everyone to vote him out because he knows he's not going home. So that's not a major knock to me. And again, he is part of the initial majority alliance on Sinapu. After he swaps, he does a pretty good job at reintegrating himself, despite the fact that he should be on the bottom, where they vote out Barry in a situation where neither Sam or Connor, despite being, again, the two outsiders there, both of them don't get votes there. He's part of the post-swap Vavau that ends up going to tribal round after round after round, but again, ends up being safe the entire time, kind of being this central figure there, with him having pretty strong bonds with Kate and Sue. So again, like I do feel like he plays that part of the game pretty well, in a position where again he shouldn't have been that well positioned. But again, the problem is obviously they come into the merge down in numbers, and to a degree that, like, again, is rarely seen in the history of Survivor, where they come into a 13-person merge with only 3 of his swap tribe remaining. I mean, I guess 4 if you want to consider Sue at that point. But either way, again, like, really didn't have much of a chance there in surviving that round. I mean, yes, you can fault him for being the victim of the split vote instead of Kate. But it's like, again, like, all these people are merge boots. And like, at the end of the day, I'm not saying he played that good of a game. Obviously, he's still number 6 on the list. I do think there are impressive elements of his game that I think as a whole, I'm just more impressed with his game than Andy. So because of that, he is here at number 6. At number 5, we're moving on to the most recent merge boot of the show. We do have KHANH. And KHANH is an interesting figure to me because he's one that has like this massive target on his back throughout the entire season, and him like openly having an idol, and through that people are targeting him, but actually votes correctly the entire time anyway. Look at his voting record. He does vote out Andy. He votes out Brianna. He does vote out Sophie. He does vote out Ben twice successfully. And during the Croc round where Croc goes home, he doesn't vote for Croc, but he knows about the Croc plan. Where the only reason he doesn't vote for Croc is because he doesn't want to piss Chrissy off. So it's like, he is someone that is in the know for every tribal that he ends up going to until the merge. And I feel like that alone is impressive on KHANH's end. You also have him holding on to his idol through a bevy of tribals until the merge as well. And to me, he's kind of like a mix of Andy and Connor to me, where like I do feel like his game is like technically a better version of Andy's, where he does have this like snaky persona that Andy had, but still ends up in the majority the entire time, unlike Andy, who was left out of the numbers at points, but also doesn't have the knock of like kind of being voted out that Connor did. And while like I feel like elements of Connor's game as a whole are probably more impressive, with him like reintegrating himself into Vavau even though he had no reason to be able to do so, I do feel like the way that KHANH played is still overall pretty impressive to me, considering the target that he had on his back. And I do think for the most part he was making optimal moves. It's just that obviously it wasn't effective, and I think a lot of that comes from how tunnel vision a lot of the players were on targeting him, which again, fault on him for not managing his threat level well enough. But to me, in comparison to the previous 2 we talked about, I still think it's slightly better. He's here at number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to someone that I think played a slightly better game than KHANH, but again, it's actually relatively close, and that person is LYDIA from Champions vs. Contenders 1. Now, Lydia's an interesting one because Lydia was not in the majority as much as KHANH was. And KHANH pretty much voted out everyone that he went for. Lydia kind of does. I mean, she initially wants Damien out in the Russell boot, doesn't get her way there, but then eventually gets Damien out next round. During the Moana boot, she's one of the people that votes for Shane, but obviously that was a split. But I mean, really, she's kind of on the bottom of her initial group for a lot of the season, which again is very similar to the way that KHANH ended up playing. I think for me, the major difference here between KHANH and Lydia is how they played the very end of their games, where while I do think KHANH plays optimally in his last few rounds, he obviously still has a massive failing in getting these people that should be very loyal to him to actually stick with him, namely in people like a Sam and a Jesse, who again, like obviously had outside circumstances in terms of their loved ones. I still do think that's a failing on his end. While with Lydia, I feel like Lydia does some impressive work at the end of her game, particularly in flipping over Benji and Robbie to have them take out Tegan and Heath to keep them around. Like they completely flip the power structure on their swap tribe, where Lydia, Sharn, and Monica come into that swap tribe down in numbers, yet come out of it on top and have the contenders come to the merge down in numbers. Now again, there is a massive lack of threat management from Lydia's end, to where she is immediately targeted after the merge for being a physical threat. But even then, again, still has Robbie and Benji still on her side. And I think really just her cultivating these relationships of Robbie and Benji is a very impressive element of her game to me. But realistically, again, it is very close between her and KHANH. I think their game trajectories are very similar for the most part, but I do feel like KHANH had more outs that he didn't end up utilizing well enough than Lydia. So again, they're both around the same ballpark, but I do have Lydia ahead at number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a player that I did debate a bit over, considering this is a person that I think you can argue being number 1 due to the fact that they were idled out of the game, but I have some counterpoints to that. And now number 3, we do have Kez from Brains vs. Brawn. Again, the only merge boot at this point to have been idled out of the game, which I think through that should elevate your placement in the sense that you weren't supposed to be the merge boot. Under a normal vote, you technically had the numbers on your side. However, I think the sticking point with Kez here, though, is that she was intentionally idled out of the game. Like, she was a person that technically the Brains did have the numbers to blindside Kez here, but they actively don't use those numbers because George knows that Haley can use the idol on Laura to take out Kez. So, like, for all intents and purposes, she was properly voted out, and she did have the majority of the tribe against her. It's just that they actively didn't utilize those votes because they knew they could get her out a different way. And again, for George in particular, in a way that greatly benefits him. So realistically, again, while like she is technically idled out, I don't really consider her on the same level as other people that were idled out of the game. And really, if you take away that aspect of her game, like her game is like relatively similar to that of a Lydia and a KHANH in terms of her positioning in the game. She does start off the game in the majority alliance, aligned with the Shannon and Flicks of the world. But even then, they don't get their way on the Benny round, where Big D ends up flipping to get rid of Benny, and they're kind of forced on the revote to vote him out. It's like, that's not ideal. Post swap, she's in the majority alliance the entire time, and does seem to be like the center figure, the person that they're like campaigning to try to flip, but doesn't really end up doing much there, really just holds strong, but again, is in the majority for a lot of it, and then again, comes into the merge in the initial majority, but a majority that is greatly reliant on George and Kara siding with them, to which George is an astute enough player to realize that's not really the way he should be playing the game, and through that Kez is taken out in a bit more of a sneaky way, with George flushing Haley's idol to get rid of Kez there. So again, like, to me, it's very much similar to that of a Lydia and a KHANH in terms of how they played the game, with really Lydia and KHANH probably being more out in front than Kez, where Kez is like probably someone that's a bit more like sniped out of the game, and part of that is due to the fact that she does find an idol and finds an idol in front of George that causes her to be targeted. It's like a double-edged sword there of like, okay, she was less out in front, so in a way she was less overt with her game, but also at the same time she kind of gets screwed over from her mistake in getting her targeted being a lot more minor than that of Lydia and KHANH. So again, at the end of the day, I do put Kez higher. Again, I do think she did less actively wrong to cause her boot, and also you still have the aspect of I guess she was idled out to fall back on. So she's here at number 3. Now at number 2, and the top 2 for me were pretty definitive. However, I did really struggle with the order here, mainly because I do think the one I have at number 2 here is probably the one that played the better game on their individual season, in terms of the game that was more likely to lead to a win, but in terms of how they played as a merge boot, in terms of how much agency and control they had up until that point, I do feel like he is slightly lower. And again, the top 2 are very, very close, but at number 2, I do have JARRAD from Australian Survivor 2017. And again, I think JARRAD's a very solid player. I mean, he's someone that I think was the second command to AK for a lot of the game. Now, he's more so in the background for the first few rounds of the game, where he's kind of just like in the middle of the tribe. He's kind of building his relationship with AK as like Adam and Kate and Tarzan get voted out. But then like once AK decides to make the move to take out Amy, JARRAD at that point becomes his second command from that point forward. Helps him in voting out Amy and then Tara and then Annalise. And then once AK gets swap screwed, it's like that's the point where JARRAD kind of gets a bit more out in front. But even then, in the eventual Ben vote out, it did very much seem like the Henry and Lockies of the world were more out in front during that vote. And if that's the case, then like we're talking about like, I guess it's the merge round where he becomes the central figure of his group, to where like he's the target because of that. So it's like, I mean, it's a game that, again, like I think is actually a pretty solid game. I think he plays a pretty solid game the entire way, kind of being in the middle of his original tribe and then being a second command to AK and then taking the reins from AK immediately afterwards. But he's also like immediately booted after he takes the reins, where he comes into the merge like down in numbers. And it's like, I don't know, it's just kind of weird to comprehend like how to assess that as a game in comparison to the next person that we talk about, who was out in front all the way up until the merge. So again, I think on paper, JARRAD played a pretty solid game here, and one that I think is for sure better than all the people we've talked about so far, but one that kind of had him more in the background for a lot of the game, which leaves him here at number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 merge boot from Australian Survivor comes from Australian Survivor All-Stars. Here we do have Locky. And again, Locky was out in front the entire time. I mean, he was always being looked at as the leader figure of his tribe, and despite that, still makes it to merge in a position where he would have been well positioned moving forward had he come in with the numbers. Now, obviously, there is an inherent lack of threat management here, a bigger lack of threat management than someone like a JARRAD or someone like a KEZ, to where, again, like he was always going to be the target at the merge had he not come in with the numbers. But I also think it works the other way around, where if he did come into merge with numbers, I think he was primed to make a very deep run on the season. Now, again, I still think it's very unlikely that he wins the season, unless he somehow was able to get as strong of a stranglehold in the game as like David was able to, but I don't suspect that to be the case. But I mean, again, I still think Locky played a very impressive game before that. I mean, he is initially the leader of the majority on Vakama, where him and Dave lead the charge to vote out Jericho. Dave then does outplay him in the round where Daisy goes home, but still not to a point where, again, Locky's ever a target there. And also, in the time between then and the swap, his group finds out that David is playing both sides and do plan on voting him out had they gone to another tribal, which they don't eventually do. But if they do end up doing so, that further cements Locky's position at the top of the tribe. Now, he does get to swap, and again, I think once again, his alliance does impressive work at the swap as well, where he doesn't come into the swap in that grave of position, where they come in tied 5-5, but Harry and Shawnee end up flipping over to his side, and he is able to keep Matt Rogers in bay for this one round, to where they end up taking out Abby here, and through that completely flips the power structure of the tribe to where he holds control up until the merge. Again, they vote out Lydia and John back to back, eventually votes out Matt Rogers, his biggest threat on the tribe, creates a really strong bond with Harry and Shawnee, where they become fully loyal to his group, and allows them to vote out Flick later in the post-swap, to where, again, they come into the merge down in numbers, mostly because they're just losing challenges. And through that, again, Locky is taken out because he is the biggest threat on the board. Again, a massive lack of threat management there, but I still do feel like he did very impressive work across the pre-merge to get the people that were loyal to him to the merge. It's just that, again, the problem is that his people ended up being the minority. But again, I think if it's a situation where had they won the penultimate immunity to keep Flick around, and then Nick ends up staying in the game, I think they just have numbers at that point to run the table. I really do feel like it's unlucky challenge results that lead to him coming down in numbers, not really anything that was a massive fault on his end. Now, obviously, we do have this like twist with Harry where he could have stopped the Nick vote out, but again, like they didn't fully know how the rules worked there. But again, I don't think Locky was that far away from potentially having a deeper run on the season. And considering how much control he had earlier on the season as well, to me, he is the clear number 1 for this list. And there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of the merge boots from Australian Survivor. Again, moving forward, I do want to do an international merge boot ranking as well, which I might wait a little bit longer for that one just to get a couple other international seasons on the board, but I still want to do that at some point. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.